Welcome to the Gems of Google Earth, a series where I uncover some of the most fascinating and oftentimes overlooked satellite images and the stories they tell. In this video, we're going to explore Oceania. Now, you might be thinking, what is Oceania? Well, it's a sort of general niche geographer term to refer to Australia, much of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. And generally speaking, all those random islands in the Pacific that you don't oftentimes think about. So, let's get started. Take a look at this image. Guess which country this is in? You might be surprised to learn that it's in Australia. After all, Australia is not famed for being snowy. Well, it just so happens to be that Australia has a mountain range that are unoriginally named the Snowy Mountains, or, in typical Aussie language, Snowies. They're the highest mountain range in all of Australia, and they're located in the southeastern state of New South Wales. That's the one Sydney is in. Not too far off from Victoria, the state that Melbourne is in. And they oftentimes sandwich the capital region where you can find Canberra. Now, to be clear, the Snowy Mountain Ranges aren't just one single mountain range, but rather part of a larger mountain range called the Great Dividing Range that stretches across much of the east coast of Australia. Not exactly on the coast, but nearby the coast. The surrounding plains provide land for some of Australia's largest cities and roughly 80% of its population, oftentimes keeping the rest of Australia to be a sort of untamed wilderness, a sort of snowy set of peaks dividing the desert from the warm temperate shores. Next on the list is Lake Hillier. This is in Western Australia. Now, Western Australia is very remote. There's only one major city, Perth, and by and large, much of the state is pretty devoid of life given its deserts. But nonetheless, it does have a few gems here and there, namely Lake Hillier, which is a pink lake, oftentimes called the Bubblegum Lake. The reason why it's pink is due to a type of red algae that produces beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is used to produce the colors of yellow and orange in various veggies that you eat, such as carrots. Now, with the mix of red algae, you get this sort of pink color. On top of that, there's also a high salt concentration. And with the power of optics via the sunlight, you get this beautiful pink hue. Next on the list is Milford Sound. Milford Sound is a fjord. A fjord is a Norwegian word, and it by and large is a geological feature formed by giant glaciers that crushed the land beneath them and then partially melted, creating these vast inlets of water into the land, which make for some spectacular scenery. By and large, fjords are usually associated with Scandinavia, but you do see them across much of the temperate and subarctic world, or subantarctic world. And it's not a surprise that the South Island of New Zealand has numerous fjords. In fact, this area is called Fiordland National Park. Overall, it's known for having a great abundance of marine life, such as dolphins and seals. After all, part of the reason why New Zealand was first settled by Europeans was for sealing and whaling. And what makes it even more unique is that in sharp contrast to most other fjords, which have boreal forests and much colder climates, this area by and large has more of a temperate climate, and you can see lush temperate rainforests above the fjords. Next on the list is in a country you may have not even heard of, and that's the Federated States of Micronesia. Micronesia is a region of literal tiny islands, usually atolls. These are basically rings of coral that by and large were the product of previously existing volcanoes. Now, you might be wondering, well, they're tiny little islands. They couldn't produce any civilization, right? Maybe just some fishermen or hunter-gatherers. Well, you'd be wrong, because there's actually a set of ancient ruins made out of coral called Nan Madol. These, by and large, are constructed by not only coral, but huge basalt stones, which weigh several tons. And the surveying is quite remarkable as well, as they're arranged in a grid pattern. Now, these people did not leave any written records for us to confirm what this site is for or was for, but it was probably given its grandeur for either A, political purposes, namely a palace for the political elites, B, religious purposes, given that that would be the meta narrative that people believed in, or C, some sort of burial for political and or religious elites, or some sort of communing with the ancestors or animistic spirits. Alas, there's a lot more research to be done. Now, keep in mind that while it looks ancient, this probably was the result of the early modern period, most likely the 15 or 1600s. After all, we're dealing with Oceania, so it took humanity several centuries to arrive in this place, let alone build such awesome complexes. Now, I talked about Micronesia, but how about Melanesia? There's another nation by the name of Vanuatu, which you probably have not heard of either. And on one island of Vanuatu, you can find the cargo cult of John Frum. This is quite possibly one of the most interesting anthropological phenomena known to man. See, these islands were extremely isolated throughout the vast majority of human history, and most people lived in a simple hunter-gatherer existence. However, during World War II, you would have some of the most advanced nations on the face of the planet Earth duke it out in the skies with their airplanes and other state-of-the-art technology. Chances are there was some American pilot that either A, during World War II or beforehand, had landed on this island and had dropped off a bunch of cargo and then flew away. Two, the people of this island who had never had contact before with the outside world, they probably saw him as a god. Perhaps the name John Frum means John from America. Some guy called John just landed here, dropped off a bunch of cargo, and then they thought that this was a message from their ancestors or animistic spirits or some sort of supernatural entity. And as a result of this, many of them even fly American flags to salute John Frum and hope that their ancestors will give them more cargo. They create replicas of planes and airstrips, thinking that this somehow will get the John Frum, or even better, their ancestors, back to their island so they can deliver more cargo. Part of me wants to tell them what actually happened, but part of me thinks it's pretty awesome that they're still doing this. Next on the list is Kiribati. However, if you actually look at the way it's written, it sounds like Kiribati. I've heard both, but given the fact that most people refer to Kiribati or something similar to that, I'm just going to go with that. Now, this island is located in the Central Pacific Ocean. It's a Polynesian island and is really remote, even by Polynesian standards. Now, what's particularly fascinating about these set of islands is that they're not going to last for much longer. Given that anthropogenic climate change is happening and glaciers are melting and the sea water is rising, it's likely that this, along with the Maldives, will be the first countries not only to face ecological catastrophe, but also just flat out disappear. And as a result of this, many of the indigenous peoples on this island have been some of the foremost proponents of fighting for climate change activism. However, many of them are also playing it safe and moving to New Zealand. Next on the list is the Bikini Atoll. I mentioned what atolls were in the past, but what makes the Bikini Atoll particularly interesting is that it's where the United States tested nuclear weapons. Now, the Bikini Atoll is part of the Marshall Islands, and by and large, this is a pretty depressing chapter in, let's just say, nuclear history, which by and large is depressing in and of itself, at least as far as the weapons are concerned. See, the US and the Soviet Union, along with other nuclear powers, needed places that were very remote in order to test their nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union did it up in the Arctic, the British did it in the deserts of Australia, and the US and France decided to use the Pacific to test their nukes. The French picked French Polynesia, but the Americans picked the Marshall Islands. And in Bikini Atoll, the native indigenous peoples would be displaced, and there would be widespread ecological destruction as a result of the explosion. This has somewhat become a legendary affair, as the word bikini actually comes from the Bikini Atoll. The designer of the swimwear thought that it would blow people away. On top of that, according to some lore, Godzilla apparently comes from the Bikini Atoll, and Bikini Bottom is also located in the Bikini Atoll. So I suppose we can thank this explosion for the existence of SpongeBob and Patrick the Starfish. Now let's move on to Easter Island. Now, Easter Island is one of the most remote of the most remote. It's the closest Polynesian island to the Americas and is currently owned by Chile in South America. It's most famous for these giant heads, and by and large is only called Easter because Dutch explorers arrived on the island on Easter. These giant statues are made out of stone, and you can see remnants of them even on the satellite images. By and large, these were there to represent ancestors or important leaders, or perhaps after those leaders died, ancestors/leaders. Many of them vary in size, but what is more remarkable about them is that the building of them may have led to this island's downfall. The excess use of resources required to build such monumental structures on a small island may have led to the exhaustion of any of the island's resources, which resulted in a lack of sustainability. Once all the wood was chopped down and all the stone was used, they could no longer use it for other more important manners of functional benefit. And as a result, much of their civilization, if you could call it that, collapsed. Today, it's oftentimes used as a case study when it comes to the overexploitation of resources. What I find interesting about the entire affair is that it shows us that indigenous peoples without complex societies can also overexploit resources just as complex industrialized societies can. Next on the list is Christmas Island. Yeah, we have a bunch of holiday islands, and yes, it's called Christmas Island because, well, sailors found it on Christmas Day. This island is owned by Australia and is sandwiched roughly halfway between Australia and Indonesia, but a little bit pushed into the Indian Ocean to the west. It, by and large, is really small in population and is not particularly impressive when it comes to size. And when you look at the island, it just kind of looks like your typical tropical island. But what I find more interesting about it is that during a certain time of the year, you get this giant avalanche of red crabs that during the breeding season across the island migrate, go to the sea to breed, creating one of the coolest migrations on the planet. Now, obviously, our satellite technology, as far as I'm concerned, at least the one available to us in Google Earth, is not sophisticated enough to see something as tiny as a crab, but I still think that it deserves a spot on this list just because of that. Now, the last on the list is one that we've all heard of, and that is a Great Barrier Reef. Now, we all know that the Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef, or more accurately, system of coral reefs on the planet. It is, in a way, a giant superorganism. Coral are by and large made up of coral polyps and algae, and many of them produce calcium hard bodies while others are soft, and they provide a spectacular array of colors and home for various forms of life. They always exist in shallow salt water nearby the shore. You can see the sheer size of it. It's roughly the size of Japan, stretching across much of Queensland's coast in northeastern Australia. The reason why I put on this list, despite being very well known, is that a lot of people don't know what coral reefs look like from space. So I just got a bunch of images just to enjoy the spectacular beauty of it. If you actually dive, you can notice that a lot of pillars of coral form very close to the surface and sometimes even exuding beyond the surface. And they by and large form these sort of miniature apartment blocks where vast sums of fish, crustaceans, and other wildlife live in. And with that, I'm gonna end this video. In my next video, I'm gonna be covering some of the gems of Google Earth in terms of fascinating buildings around the world that are oftentimes overlooked, so stay tuned.